report on this. Right, let's change over.
Yeah.
If we get cold.
Mine's all right. Position.
Are you?
What's that? Mine's
Yeah.
all right position.
Can I just take that? There.
That's it. Yeah, you're good to go.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Have I remembered everything? Yes, I probably have. Right, there we are, everyone, after that little interlude where I just confessed some of my teenage sins. Welcome to everyone. Nice to have you with us. I will change the trees next week as Judy's background. It's time for winter, I think. I think we've covered all that. Nothing else to say. I will be circulating an email later this week about the next quiz to be held at the Methodist Church in Bowmere, which is very popular, so popular that they're going to have to restrict tickets. So for those of you that do like it, and I know that numbers of you do, you'll need to get your arse in gear and get on the phone or on the email. Judy?
Yeah.
Over to you.
Thank you.
I'll get you water.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you again. The enmity, I've called this the enmity between England and Scotland. So we're still on Edward I. I didn't spend as much time as maybe I should have done on his reforms regarding the law. But just quickly to summarise, he didn't bring in many new laws, but what he did was Edward I was very concerned about accountability. Well, I think that's what we call it today. They didn't call it that then. Accountability, which is something we seem to lack today. We keep hearing about more and more scandals, large organisations like the water boards, the water companies, not doing what they're supposed to do. And you keep thinking, well, who's in charge? Why doesn't anybody know about these?
Who's going to be punished?
Yes, who's going to be punished? And why doesn't anybody know what's going on until the press find out about it and it becomes a scandal? And it's reported and we start thinking the country's falling apart. And the usual excuse is, oh, we're short-staffed, which is a poor excuse, really, for all sorts of things that we know about now that are going wrong in our society. Somebody not held accountable and nobody punished when something goes wrong, and then everybody knows about it, and then there are lots of excuses and nothing seems to happen, nothing seems to change. Well, that's what Edward I was good at sorting out and insisting that people are accountable. And if they didn't do their job properly, then they would be punished. They would be not just sacked, but punished in some way.
Cut bits
And
off.
everybody smartened up their act. And it's why the army and a large, well, the army mainly, and the Navy and the Air Force, they do constant inspections. Because they know, I've said this before, people get a bit casual when they're not inspected. Too many inspections, of course, can be self-defeating, but it is important that people are held to account. If they hold a top job, they should be earning their money. So this is what Edward I was famous for, really, sort of going around the kingdom, checking up personally, but making sure that those who, the people he'd appointed, the sheriffs and so on, were doing their job properly, not taking bribes. They were working for the crown. They were working for the king. But I didn't go into great detail because when I looked at my university notes, there were pages and pages and pages of it. And I can remember sitting in the lectures thinking, wow, this is going on a bit. And this isn't exactly enthralling. And I found to my horror that I couldn't really remember any of it. And having taught it over the years to U3A, still couldn't remember it. Thinking, well, if it hadn't made an impact on me, I'd better not sort of share it with you, because you're not going to find it very fascinating either, if it's so non-memorable. But we do need to pay tribute to the king. We do need to pay tribute to Edward I for this smartening up of systems that he'd inherited, creating one or two new systems, but particularly making people do their job properly, or they got the sack, or worse, and somebody more efficient was put in place. Makes you wonder what he would think about the the current situation in politics. But the other reason he's famous, of course, is dealing with the Welsh and building all those wonderful castles. But even more, he's famous for the situation, the relationship between England and Scotland. I mean, it's written on his tomb, the hammer of the Scots. It's written in Latin, the hammer of the Scots. That's how he wanted to be remembered, that it sorted the Scots out. At least he thought he had. He hadn't really. Not very easy to sort the Scots out, but he thought he had. So the main issue was the overlordship of Scotland. Although it was a separate country, had its own royal family, its own laws, its own culture, the fact was that the Scottish kings had to pay homage to the English kings for land held in England. It was never a happy arrangement. The Scots resented it, and it was never really properly sorted out. It just caused resentment. And then in 1286, things came to a head when the King of Scotland, Alexander III, who had been successful King of Scotland, and he had an accident and died very suddenly and unexpectedly. Riding accident, broke his neck and died. And his heir was a little girl. Disaster for any dynasty to be left in that situation. A double whammy, an infant and the wrong gender. In fact, 3 whammies, because she lived in Norway. Oh. So this was not just a disaster, but a sort of turning point in Scottish history. They got to go and fetch this little girl back. She was only 3. Her nickname, or her name, was the Fair Maid of Norway. That was the title that she received afterwards, because another tragedy. The poor little girl died on the sea voyage to Scotland. She was being brought back to become, like Mary Queen of Scots, the same situation, inherited when she was a child. She was being brought back from Norway to inherit the crown of Scotland, and got blood poisoning, food poisoning on the way back and died. So there was no King of Scotland or Queen of Scotland. So what did they do? The Scottish nobles turned to the King of England, because there were 2 contestants, Robert the Bruce and John Balliol of Balliol College. Well, in the future, Balliol College. So there were contestants. So somebody needed to be the arbiter or referee, and they turned to their overlord. That was the correct thing to do, according to the feudal system and the hierarchy. They turned to the King of England. who of course was totally delighted by this. He got his own agenda. He wanted to conquer and occupy and overcome Scotland. So this suited him very well indeed. He was being asked to be the arbiter in what became known as the Great Cause. Who would be the next King of Scotland? All down to the King of England to make the decision between these two contestants. And so the King of England, made the decision. He chose John Balliol, and he made conditions. Of course he did. This was his great opportunity. Fortune had played into his hands. Oh, God, he thought God had done this. God had surrendered the Scots into English keeping. So on condition that John Balliol did homage for the kingdom of Scotland, and made it very clear that he was going to kneel down in front of the King of England. It was a proper little homage ceremony. You knelt down, held your hands out, and the overlord put his hands round your hands. You had your hands as if you were praying, and he put his hands round your hands to show who was dominant, who was in charge. And you then, the one kneeling down, made the declaration of homage. I will be your liege, you will be my liege lord, and I will be your vassal for life and limb. In other words, I will do anything you ask me to do. I belong to you. It was very profound. And if you were kneeling down, it did mean that you were almost in the position of supplication. You were humble. You were kneeling down. The other guy was standing up. So this is humbling, a humbling little ceremony. The act of homage, paying homage. So it was visual. Everybody could see the person kneeling down, paying homage. So King Edward then pushed his luck, because that's the sort of person he was. Not content with John Balliol having paid homage, he then started to push harder to make sure that the Scots knew who their overlord was, and that they were simple, they were a vassal nation. He demanded that the Scots produced an army when the King of England was going to invade Gascony. The Scots must supply troops. Now, he didn't need to do that. He got plenty of troops of his own. He didn't really need Scottish support. It was his way of sort of rubbing their noses in the dirt, making it absolutely clear who was boss. And you can imagine it didn't go down terribly well with the Scots, who were already feeling humiliated and feeling that God had abandoned them. They'd lost the king that they admired and looked up to, and then the little girl had died. They were feeling victimized in a way, that God had abandoned them, and now that they were being pushed around by the King of England, and they were full of resentment, as we can appreciate and understand. And then the Welsh rebelled. And the Scots thought, our fortunes are changing. This is great. The king's got problems. The King of England's got problems. This is our opportunity to look round for somebody to help us in this situation we find ourselves in through no fault of our own. And that's when they decided that they would make an alliance with France. And it became known as the Old Alliance because it lasted for such a long time. Dangerous for England, because that meant that they'd have an enemy in the north and an enemy in the south, and we'd be like the filling in a sandwich, England in the middle. A dangerous situation. England virtually surrounded by enemies. And of course, Edward I was absolutely furious about this, because underdogs are not supposed to make alliances without permission. The Scots certainly hadn't said, is it all right if we make an alliance with France? They hadn't asked permission at all, so they were out of order, they were out of line. So Edward I, absolutely furious, absolutely spitting feathers, decided that the Scots needed to be taught a military lesson. They needed to be sorted out. They weren't behaving like a vassal state at all. They were acting as though they were independent and could make their own decisions. So he marched north with the idea of conquering Scotland, sorting them out once and for all. And it all went very well. John Balliol stripped of his kingship. He was very much on the naughty step for acting independently. Scotland became a province administered by England, a most awful humiliation. You could say, well, they'd asked for it. But on the other hand, you could also say they were pushed into this by King Edward, sort of strutting around, throwing his weight about and humiliating them. Well, the poor Scots were humiliated in two very specific ways. Their crown jewels were confiscated and taken to England. And something even more precious, the famous stone of Scone was confiscated and taken to Westminster Abbey and placed under the English coronation chair, where it remained for centuries. A great big slab of stone. Some of you have probably seen it. The coronation chair was adapted to make room for it. And there it stayed. I remember going to Westminster Abbey when I was little and getting very excited about seeing this chair and then thinking, well, what a disappointment. It's so tatty and horrible. I don't know, imagine the coronation chair. It's covered with graffiti where people have carved their initials into it. It's a mess and it's shabby. And there was this ugly stone underneath, which I thought, what on earth is that doing under a throne? I was expecting it to be all gold and silver and jewels and sparkly and lovely. I was totally disappointed. Couldn't get over why I was being shown this shabby object, and it was so special. And I couldn't understand what that stone was doing. I remember being quite worried about it. I thought perhaps somebody had put it there by accident and just sort of put it there because they couldn't think of anywhere else to put it and why it was special. And it took me years to find out that it was very, very important. The stone was very important symbolically and in a ritual way, and that it was to humiliate the Scots. And then, of course, they stole it back. So the Scots...
And broke it.
I broke it. The Scots were then totally furious at how they were being treated, and massive nationalistic fervour took over from people who had quite a laid-back attitude, really weren't interested in politics or who their overlord was, just wanted to get on with their farming or whatever. But now their blood was up. They had been humiliated, absolutely humiliated, and nationalistic fervour took over. And William Wallace became their new leader and actually won a victory at Stirling Bridge. So it seemed as though God was now supporting the Scots against the English. God had abandoned the English. And for the next 8 years, King Edward concentrated, when he wasn't still campaigning in Wales, slowly wore down Scottish resistance, slowly wore it down. And eventually the King of France abandoned the alliance with the Scots, which gave Edward huge encouragement and meant the Scots were willing to come to terms with the English. They couldn't go on fighting without believing that the French would come in and help them when necessary. So Robert the Bruce emerges as another fine leader, the son of the previous Robert the Bruce, and had himself inaugurated as King of the Scots in 1306, and we're still allowed to have a royal family. And King Edward decided he was going to subdue the Scots once and for all. It was damaging his reputation that the Scots wouldn't acknowledge that they were the underdogs and stay there They got to be in a submissive situation. They got to acknowledge that they had submitted, and they weren't doing any such thing. So the Pope was persuaded to excommunicate Robert the Bruised. That was always a useful thing to have happen, because if God had abandoned somebody, that meant that they would go to hell when they died, etc. So they were a pariah. They were a cursed person. So if you supported them, you would be cursed as well. So it's very useful to have the Pope on side. And Edward I did have, because he'd been a crusader and he'd written a very nice letter. Very polite letter asking the Pope to intervene in this situation. He then sent a very well-equipped army to Scotland and then savagely punished the Scots as rebels. Now you might say, well, they're not rebels, they're nationalists, they're fighting their cause, they have a perfect right to fight for their country and their country's independence. Or you could say, no, they've got obligations, feudal obligations, they're rebels. And in law, of course, there is a difference, or there certainly was then. Rebels, the punishments for rebellion were really horrible. Whereas if you're punishing free people, that's a different issue. So Robert the Bruised was forced into hiding, famous story of Spider, giving him encouragement. Try, if at first you don't succeed, try again, because he'd seen a spider in a cave, trying over and over again to build its web and failing, and then trying again. And the spider was sort of seen as an inspiration. So Robert the Bruised forced into hiding, and the family of Robert the Bruised treated horribly as an example, a deterrent. Look what will happen if you carry on being rebellious. So, example of horrible treatment. Robert the Bruised's sister, Mary, was imprisoned literally in a cage. Quite a small cage, like an animal, in Rosborough Castle for 4 years. And his younger brother, Neil, was actually given the full punishment for being a rebel, hanged, drawn and quartered, which even in medieval times was seen as an extreme punishment because it was so incredibly painful. So it combined being put to death with torture, or the other way around, torture and then finally being put to death. But people watching while somebody went through absolute agonies. It was a slow, horrible way to die. Only used for rebels as a deterrent, a warning, this could happen to you. So don't join any rebellious uprisings. Don't get involved. Look what happens. So just to repeat what happened, the hanging bit, they hanged you and left you dangling and choking and then cut you down before you died. And if you would become unconscious, they revived you deliberately so that you would feel what was going to happen next and be afraid. So you were hanged, choked, then you were cut down, revived if necessary. Then your tummy was split open. You'd been below your navel. Your intestines were lifted out. Sometimes they were burned or tortured, and people were apparently still awake. They hadn't passed out with pain. They were still able to feel. And then finally killed and chopped into 4 pieces. And then the 4 pieces were were sent to different parts of the kingdom to be put on a pole with a label. Not that many people could read, but there was a notice to say who the quarter was of. And they were put high up on city gates. And as cities and towns had walls that survived in places like Canterbury and York, over the gate, so that as you came into the city or town, you saw this horrible bleeding mess on a pole. And if you couldn't read, then you asked, who's that? And it was a horrible, horrible deterrent and a horrible reminder that the king was boss and that the king would take any rebellion extremely seriously, and that this could happen to you. And we think it was probably quite effective as a warning. But having treated the king of Scotland's family in such a barbaric way, and we have to say it was barbaric, it wasn't very likely that the Scots were going to come to order and going to say, all right, we've had enough. We accept and acknowledge that you are our overlord, and we'll do we'll be obedient in future. We'll do whatever you say. Quite the reverse. Quite the reverse. That if you treat people as badly as that, they are not going to lie down and make purring noises. They are going to be very, very angry. They're going to fight back. So the relationship between Scotland and England remained very difficult until, of course, the end of the Tudors, when James I became the heir, and he was actually the King of Scotland. Actually, the King of Scotland. But the union with Scotland only took place in the reign of Queen Anne. And many Scots, of course, have never accepted that they belong to the United Kingdom. They belong to Great Britain. So Scottish nationalism has continued to be lively, and they have a difficult history to look back on, where they feel they've been treated very, very badly by the English, and taken over by the English. The treaty in 1707, the Act of Union, well, not treaty, the Act, did allow Scottish education to continue and Scottish law to continue, because that is different. That was kind of concession made to help the Scots to accept the Union. But in many regards, it not always been a happy relationship. And we know now that there are many Scots who would like to be independent once again, not to have a monarchy again, but have a president and be a separate individual country, not part of the United States, not part of the United Kingdom. So we've got a situation where Edward I had, you could say, hammered the Scots into submission, but it was a sort of a situation. It was never a happy situation, and it caused massive resentment in Scotland, and actually for many people in England. Sort of why is the king spending so much money? I mean, the taxes went up to pay for all these armies going up to Scotland. Why is the king so obsessed with bringing the Scots into line? And you could say that God then took. Some people thought that God had then taken an interest in what was going on and taken sides. The king was marching towards Scotland. He was ill. He was weak with dysentery. And dysentery was what lots of people got when they were on campaign, because hygiene was so difficult, and the food often went bad. Even for kings, campaigning wasn't easy. So on the 6th of July, 1307, the king was camping near the Scottish border, and everybody could see that he was a very, very ill man. He insisted on leading his troops, on riding his horse, trying to look as though he was the leader he'd been all these years, this strong man with the long legs, long shanks, in control, in charge, a proud man, not willing to admit that he was in agony and he could hardly sit on his horse. But eventually he had to admit that he couldn't ride anymore, and died on the 6th of July, leaving a grown-up heir, his son, the one that had been presented to the Welsh The legend says on his father's shield, using it as a temporary sort of carry cot, presented to the people in Carnarvon, because the baby had just been born. Here is your prince. He cannot speak a word of English. And ever since then, the eldest son of the monarch has been designated Prince of Wales. So the first Prince of Wales is now coming to the throne as Edward II. Martin's found some excellent illustrations, which I hope you've sort of looked at and read the commentary at the side. All sorts of like the sword, the Wallace sword.
God,
So
he must have been tall to manage that, mustn't he?
yes, he was. Well, Edward I did look like a king. That was a great advantage, and his son also looked kingly. This was another thing. He was sort of leaving a son who in early life had been described as fair of body and great of strength. Which sounds good. So, early life of Edward II, who was king for just 20 years. Born in Carnarvon Castle, son of Edward I and Queen Eleanor. 2 sons preceded him, and his older brother, Prince Alonso, died 4 months later. Edward became the heir. Queen Eleanor had 16 children altogether. Some books say 14, but she had 16 altogether. I think 2 were very premature or miscarriages, but obviously they count. You'd think that if you had so many children, you would have lots and lots and lots of heirs and spares, and that you would have lots of grandchildren. It didn't work that way. Whether there was something genetically wrong with the Queen, we don't know, but the children died. Many of them died in infancy. One theory is that Queen Eleanor was the most fantastic consort. She was absolutely amazing, a wonderful partner, absolutely amazing. She travelled with her husband when he was campaigning. So she had babies in all these different castles. Some people have suggested that it would have been a lot better if she'd stayed in a beautifully furnished palace where the bedding would be absolutely fine and everything would be sort of calm and peaceful when she was in labour, instead of travelling around with her husband until the very last minute and she was actually in labour and then giving birth whichever castle they were staying at. You know, she was a campaigning wife, but she was also pregnant a lot of the time. 16 pregnancies during this period. However, Edward appeared to be healthy and grew up to be fair of body and had great strength. Being very well educated, he understood Latin, he spoke Norman French and English, which was still 2 separate languages. He had to learn both. They hadn't melded together as one language. They were in the process of doing, but you still had to learn both. And he grew up to be apparently very religious, very generous to the church, especially the Dominican friars. And he made pilgrimages to Canterbury. You know, he seemed to tick all the boxes. He seemed to be absolutely fine as an heir. People were really not exactly looking forward to him being king, but certainly thinking, we are going to be in good hands. He's got all the virtues, he's got all the attributes that a king should have. He looks good, he's strong and he's healthy and he's religious and he's well qualified in terms of learning. What's not to like? Well, what was not to like was he got some very odd hobbies. Very odd. And we don't quite know why he had these hobbies, because they really were out of line with what you expected a prince to be interested in. He liked what were called rustic crafts, the kind of thing that peasants, qualified peasants did, artisan peasants. For example, thatching. What a weird thing to like to do. thatching, of all weird things, hedging and ditching, which meant getting your hands dirty, shoeing horses. Why on earth would a prince want to learn how to shoe horses? And once he'd learned, I mean, he might show an interest in shoeing horses. Horses were the cars of the day, like a lad being interested in cars now, but a prince wanted to know actually how to shoe horses, and then actually shoeing horses himself was beyond eccentric. It was weird. And he liked rowing. You might say, well, that's all right. That makes you strong. It makes your arms nice and strong, ready for battle. Well, it was considered considerably peculiar at the time. And the one that was really weird was swimming. Now, it doesn't seem weird to us at all, but until almost this century, well, not this century, the 20th century, swimming wasn't a popular activity. And the really odd thing was in the Middle Ages, Tudor, Stuart, right through to the 19th century, even sailors didn't know how to swim. Which is why the number of men who died on the Mary Rose, the famous royal flagship, which Henry VIII watched actually sink just off the coast, while he was watching from Southsea, he watched his wonderful ship sink. The men couldn't swim. You think, well, you know, they're in the Royal Navy, why can't they swim? You think that would be essential in one of the qualifications for being a sailor. Or, even if it wasn't a qualification, that they would have the sense to learn to swim in the event that their ship foundered or they were shipwrecked. But no, people could not swim. And that's why the Royal Lifeboat Association started, because men couldn't swim, had to be rescued. If they could get to a rock or cling to wreckage, then they waited to be rescued. They couldn't swim. So what was the king thinking? Swimming, what we now call cold water swimming. He swam in rivers, not the sea. Admittedly, that would have been really very, very eccentric indeed. They probably have locked him away somewhere and decided he was sort of mentally afflicted if he'd swum in the sea. But rivers, why on earth would a prince want to do such a weird thing when ordinary people couldn't swim? What was the prince doing, thinking it was a good idea? People are afraid of water. They're afraid of getting cold, getting a chill, turning into pneumonia. There were no cures. Well, herbal cures. So what on earth is the king doing? The prince doing, sort of swimming up and down rivers and making, obviously his courtiers, his entourage had to go with him and watch him. They were thinking, this is well peculiar. Swimming, rowing, why? Was it defiance? Was this his kind of like teenage rebellion? I am going to be different. Or was it, which is more convincing, that his parents, he hardly knew his parents. They were away campaigning. Or say the Queen went with her husband, with the king. He hardly saw his parents. He was a lonely child. So, as happened with other famous people, not necessarily royal, but sometimes aristocratic children, neglected by parents, therefore mixed with servants, therefore do what the servants do. They're mixing with the lower orders, you could say. Was it defiance? Was it just to make his parents angry? Because it did make them angry. Why was he doing these lowly things? Why was he mixing with the lower classes? You know, the feudal system was the class system times 10. He didn't mix with peasanty people. He didn't mix with artisans. And he was the prince actually asking artisans to share their knowledge, their skills, and not just watching in an interested way. That would have been all right, probably, but joining in and being very proud of his skills. That he could do all that. He thatched well, and he could do hedging and ditching. even today, we might think that was, you know, if Prince William was doing things like this, we might think, oh, he's overdoing that a bit. You know, he's royal. So this was the downside, if you like, of Prince Edward, that he was maverick. He was eccentric. He was a little bit hard to understand, put it that way. Known as Edward of Carnarvon, because that's where he'd been born, not usually called the Prince of Wales. He acted as his father's regent while his father was campaigning in Gascony. And he had succeeded. He'd been all right in that role. The French wars were ended in 1299. 2 marriages arranged. That was usually the way, you know, marriages were arranged in those days, and very often after a war, a marriage was arranged to sort of cement the new relationship. There was a peace treaty, and part of the peace treaty was a marriage treaty. In this case, it was a double one. The king, who was now well in middle life, had lost Eleanor, of course, the love of his life, Eleanor Crosses, was persuaded to marry again. Margaret of France became his second queen. And the prince was betrothed to his daughter, also called the French king's daughter, Margaret, who was only 8, so he's going to have to wait for her to grow up. And the second marriage for Edward I was very successful in terms of companionship. Margaret of France turned out to be a very good consort, accepting that, you know, he'd never feel about her the way he'd felt about his first wife. She totally sort of acknowledged and accepted that. But healthy sons born, one after the other. So that does suggest that there may have been something a bit genetically amiss with Eleanor, because so many of the children died in infancy. So a very successful marriage for Edward I, and Prince Edward's marriage obviously postponed until his princess grew up and matured and was old enough to get married, probably about 15. But the previous year, 1298, big turning point for Prince Edward, because that's when he met his young Gascon friend. This is when it gets interesting. He met Piers Gaveston, who was then made a squire of the royal household and royal ward, a fateful relationship. Historians have spent an awful lot of time trying to work out exactly what this relationship, what was this relationship? What did it consist of? Was it a gay relationship? Was it a very intense friendship? What exactly was the nature of this relationship? Very hard to find out after all these centuries have passed, because homosexuality was a closed book. It was not discussed. It was not talked about. It wasn't like today. It was very, very much not like today. It was hidden, not acknowledged, very, very much frowned upon, of course, by the church, and almost who could imagine such a thing? It was almost like, how could this possibly be? And certainly not with the royal family. You know, you wouldn't even consider such a possibility. The royal family had to be above reproach in that regard. They had to be totally ethical in every possible way and follow Bible teaching. And therefore, the idea that the prince might be homosexual was, say, wasn't that it wasn't considered, it was sort of rejected, considered and then rejected in a kind of horrified way. But it has fascinated historians ever since, because it was a very, very, in whatever form it took, it was an incredibly intense relationship. And Piers Gaveston was a very attractive character, has to be said. Not easy to hate. He was very, very charismatic. He was, pardon me, handsome, witty, very, very funny, made people laugh, very self-confident, excellent at all the kind of knightly sports, the martial arts and riding. He looked absolutely fine on a horse. He was very, very irreverent. He got a fantastic sense of humour. Made up nicknames for people at court, which were very, very amusing, as long as you weren't the recipient of the nickname. People weren't falling about laughing if Piers Gaveston decided to give you a nickname. It was more of a kind of satirical nickname. It was a bit like some of the news programmes today. Have I got more news for you? Those sort of programmes where they're mocking people in power, poking fun at them. And that's what Piers Gaveston was like. He was like a satirist and very clever. Some of the nicknames he thought up were very, very clever. They had to refer to somebody's looks or their personality or some mistake they'd made. Well, when nobody wants a nickname that reminds everybody of a mistake they've made, it might be hilariously funny for everybody else, but not for the person that has been given the nickname. They are going to be filled with resentment and want to pull this person off their perch, the person that's given them the nickname. And that's what Gaveston lacked. He sort of lacked tact, diplomacy, and an understanding of what it was like to be the recipient of his rather cruel nicknames. I mean, sometimes they were hilariously funny and fitting, and sometimes they were quite cruel. And so he made enemies right, left, and centre. Some people were sort of falling about laughing. Other people were scowling and enraged. And some people have said, well, that was the attraction for Edward. He'd had a lonely childhood. He'd been criticised for some of his hobbies. And he met this young man who became, and he hadn't had many friends, because it's hard for royalty to have friends, unless they've got brothers and sisters that, they've got people of equal status. It's very hard for them to have friends. This was the first time he'd had a really good mate, a really good friend. And some people have argued that it wasn't homosexual at all. It was just this very, very fantastic, intense friendship. But certainly Piers became a very important personality in the court. People couldn't ignore him, because it was impossible to ignore him, because he was a very confident person. He was like a personality today, impossible to ignore. And so people started to have an opinion about Piers Gaveston. He was very much like Marmite. People either loved him or hated him. And because he seemed to be there all the time, people began to judge the Prince of Wales, the young prince, and say, well, we wish he'd hurry up and get tired of this Piers Gaveston. Everywhere you look, there's Piers Gaveston. And the king's obviously done some dotes on him. What exactly is their relationship? Even if it's not sexual, it's dangerous. This young man doesn't respect authority. He spends his time thinking of nicknames for people in authority, mocking them, laughing about them. This is not good for our future king. This young Gascon is a bad influence and should be got rid of. We need to disgrace him in some way. We need to catch him out. We need to sort of point out to the prince that this is not a suitable, this young man is not a suitable companion. Whatever the relationship is, he's not a suitable companion. He's too full of himself. He's too quick and witty in a negative sort of way. We need to get rid of him. Well, then, 1301, after the successful Scottish campaign, the king gave his heir the official title of Prince of Wales, which in other words, they could use the title, and Earl of Chester, which Princes of Wales still have, the two titles. And King Edward seemed very pleased with his son. He didn't acknowledge the rumours at court and the growing dissatisfaction with Piers and with his son. He didn't acknowledge that at all. He didn't seem to think that was an issue. Probably because he'd been away campaigning most of the time. He didn't know what was going on back in England at the court. He didn't understand how much resentment was building up against this cheeky young man with his witticisms and his ability to make people laugh and to pick on people and mock them. So in the summer of 1305, quarrel, discord developed. No actual details exist, but these are the facts that are known. A quarrel between Prince Edward and Walter Langton, Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield, to do with some alleged hijinks in the bishop's deer park. I'll explain about that again next time. Leading to banishment from court. The Exchequer was forbidden to fund the prince until instructed. The prince is on the naughty step because he and Piers Gaveston are now a kind of team. The prince is beginning to say naughty things. He has been influenced, just as everybody said he was going to be. He was being influenced by his cheeky, mouthy friend. And his father has finally found out and realised, rather late in the day, that Piers Gaveston is not a good companion for his son, the future king. But it's believed that the king had possibly worked out that it was more than just an intense friendship and that the two young men were sleeping together. And alarm bells had started to ring. And so, being Edward I, thought he came down like a ton of bricks, having worked out what was going on. Prince Edward actually asked his new stepmother, Margaret of France, to intercede on his behalf. Desperately worried that the king was going to overreact and send Piers Gaveston into exile, send him away. And then 1305, in the autumn, reconciliation, partly because of the new queen, Margaret. Great banquet in Westminster Hall, which was still there. Prince Edward knighted by his father, so this is his way of acknowledging that his son is his heir and that he favours him and loves him. And this seemed to be the end of the issue, except it wasn't. 1307, Prince Edward asked the king for a title for Piers, and the king was absolutely furious. So Edward, Prince of Wales, fair dues, won't abandon his friend. He's saying, not only have I not abandoned him, I want him to be raised in status, so he is an appropriate friend of mine. So why don't you make him Count of Ponthieu? Why don't you give him a title? And then he is a worthy companion. What's the problem? Well, the problem was that the king was trying to sort of get rid of Piers Gaveston, not raise him to the peerage. And so the king lost his temper and did what Edward had been dreading. Edward, Prince of Wales, had been absolutely dreading. Sent Piers Gaveston into exile, banished him, leaving Edward, Prince of Wales, absolutely distraught. And that's when we begin to realise that this wasn't just an intense friendship. To him, it was like a bereavement. He took it so much to heart. It became more and more obvious that it was more than just a friendship. And then, a few weeks later, King Edward dies. And Edward, Prince of Wales, becomes Edward II. And everybody is wondering, what kind of king is he going to make? Because he now seems, because of the way he'd reacted when his friend was sent into exile, was banished, he more or less put his cards on the table. So ever since then, there's been this, excuse me, this question as to whether or not Edward was homosexual, was gay, at a time when it was absolutely, totally not allowed by the church. It was evil, it was a sin. The whole situation was fraught with problems. So we're going to look at the reign of Edward II. I'm sure you all know how it ended. It did not end well for Edward. But it's a very interesting reign in all sorts of ways. And Edward II is a very interesting personality. He seemed more modern than the kings we've been looking at up to now, who seemed very remote, spent all their time campaigning or going on crusade or basically fighting. It's actually very interesting to have a king that's got some other interests, that's got these interesting, strange hobbies, because that makes him seem more modern and more relatable, and we can sort of feel that we know him. Because I don't know about you, I don't feel that I can relate to some of the early medieval kings, because they just seem so remote. Always riding about trying to kill people. So Edward II is a very interesting character, and I hope you're looking forward to finding out more about him, or what kind of reign he had. Was he any good as king? Because he'd rather blotted his copybook as Prince of Wales. So what was he going to be like when he actually came to power? Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Judy. You'll probably hate me for it, but we have one more session before Christmas. We're meeting again on Zoom on the 4th of December. So we'll look forward to that. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your support.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin.